Hello, and welcome to the second part of a special panel discussion that began this past fall, the Sentencing Project. The focus this evening is on racial sentencing disparities, female incarceration, and community collateral damages. My name is Deborah Hurd, and I am the project coordinator for the 50th anniversary celebration of the Department of Black Studies at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Tonight's event is a part of the department's year-long celebration of 50 years of existence. This department was born of the global struggle of Black and Brown people of the 1960s and 70s to liberate themselves from the social, political, economic, and mental oppression from which they had been suffering, and to move toward the development of new independent futures based on their own cultural understandings of their societies and the world. Here in the US, the participation of Black high school and college students were critical to the civil rights movement and were the primary force of the Black Power movement. The activism of Black students on college campuses did not take long to find its way to the University of Nebraska at Omaha. On November 10th, 1969, 54 Black UNO students staged a sit-in in the president's office for his failure to address issues of racial discrimination and cultural relevance on this campus. The police were called and all of the students were arrested. The arrest of the Omaha 54 brought together Omaha's Black civic and social organizations and churches for the goal of bailing out all 54 of the students that very day, as well as standing behind them in their negotiations with the university's administration. One of the students' demands was the creation of a Department of Black Studies. And because of their persistence, 2 years later, in the fall of 1971, this department came into existence. So we're spending this year looking back to where it all started 50 years ago, as we look ahead to where the department and this discipline must go. It is because of the vision and the sacrifice of the Omaha 54 and the support of the Black community in Omaha that this department exists. And it is because of their continued support that this department continues to exist. We salute you and we thank you. As a discipline that studies, analyzes, and critiques the continuing effects of historical enslavement, colonization, land dispossession, and corporate imperialism, we must acknowledge that this university and the very city itself sits on the sacred tribal lands of the Native American people for whom this city is named, the Omaha, and that of other First Nation people who regarded this land as their communal homeland. We stand in solidarity with you. Finally, we continue to pray for the end of the occupation and war in Ukraine. We pray for the safety of all of the innocent people trapped in Ukraine, whether Ukrainian or immigrant. And we pray for the safe passage of all those fleeing the terror and violence for neighboring borders, including the thousands of African, Indian, and other immigrant students who have been stopped by police and Border Patrol agents and prohibited from boarding trains, buses, or merely walking across a border to safety. We pray for the safety and security of all of the people caught up in this war. Now I would like to introduce the moderator for tonight's event, Professor Terry Crawford. Professor Terry L. Crawford is currently the Community Fellow for the UNO Service Learning Academies, addressing redlining through Community Engagement Initiative, and an adjunct professor in the Department of Black Studies in Criminology and Criminal Justice. She is an activist, advocate, historian, writer, and educator at the intersection of social justice, community engagement, and public policy. Professor Crawford earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Paralegal Studies and Legal Administration from the College of St. Mary in Omaha, and a Juris Doctorate from the Creighton University School of Law. Her research and scholarship integrate issues of race and the law, critical legal theory, criminology, criminal justice, and the foundations of American law. She has a long history of advocacy for those whose voices are unheard or ignored, whether in the courtroom, the classroom, or the community. In addition to her appointment as Community Fellow, she serves as the Public Policy Director for the League of Women Voters, the Greater Omaha Chapter, and she is a past Legal Redress Chair for the NAACP. She's also President of the Omaha Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Professor Crawford, the floor is yours.
I need to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Professor Hurd, for that introduction. I'm excited to be able to have this conversation tonight with the Sentencing Project and also with Nation Outside. Thank you for part 2 and engaging in this conversation with us in the state of Nebraska as we talk about steps that we need to take locally to activate what we want to see happen in this city. Tonight, I am really happy to have Darrell Douglas with the Sentencing Project with us. We have Alexandra Bailey with the Sentencing Project and Tony Gant with Nation Outside. I'm going to turn it over to each one of you and allow you to introduce yourselves. And if we can just go in that order, that would be great. Mr. Douglas first, Ms. Bailey, and then Mr. Gant. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Crawford, for having us. My name is Darrell Douglas, and I'm the National Jail-Based Voting Organizer with the Sentencing Project. Born and raised in Houston, Texas, I saw firsthand what the broken justice system looks like because my very first job was as a prison guard in the state of Texas. After a 5-year career there, I decided to take what I learned and put it into creating a world where fewer people that look like me, come from zip codes like mine, or whose parents' paychecks look like mine, ended up behind the bars at prisons. And I'll pass it over to Alex.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor Crawford, for having me, and to the University of Nebraska Omaha for your incredible legacy. It is a real honor to be here. My name is Alexandra Bailey. I lead the campaign strategy to for our End Life Imprisonment campaign here at the Sentencing Project. I focus predominantly on ending life and long sentences. The terrible companion to our death penalty, the great shame of our nation, the legacy of a history of slavery, and all of the things that your university fights against. I come from a family that's, like so many others, has somebody who is serving a life without parole sentence. And it's just such an honor to be able to be here to talk about this topic. And I really can't wait to get started. Thank you.
First, yes, thank you, Professor Crawford. This is an honor, really, to be on this panel, considering where I came from. I'm a formerly incarcerated African-American man who spent 20 years in prison. So it's kind of amazing to be here with you distinguished people to discuss something so close to my heart. I'm currently the policy director for Nation Outside. Nation Outside is a kind of unique organization because we're led by formerly incarcerated people. We believe that our lived experience is a voice that needs to be at the table. Our mission is to drive policy, to create transformative systems of support for people with criminal histories, because we know what it's like to get out of prison and to get door after door slammed in your face. We know what that can lead to. And so I'm just thrilled to be here. I'm thankful for this conversation again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to all three of you. I really appreciate you being here to have this discussion with us tonight. So let's just talk about some second look policies and exactly what that is, some of the work that has been done by the Sentencing Project, some of the work that you've been involved in also, Mr. Gant, regarding second look legislation, and maybe what that could look like in a place like Nebraska and some of the other jurisdictions that you've worked with. So for those that are on the call that are not familiar with what second look legislation or policy is, Andrea, can you kind of unpack exactly what that is and why it's important? And then we can talk about some of the policies that have already been enacted in some of the jurisdictions that each one of you have worked with.
Second look legislation is very exciting, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It is a mechanism whereby somebody serving a long sentence can be reviewed by their sentencing judge to either be given time served or to have a massive reduction in sentence. As we know, there are many society attitudes that have changed towards things that have caused stacking of sentences. We have a completely different view of marijuana in the vast majority of states, and yet we have many people who are serving very long sentences, due to the various drug policies, due to the tough on crime era, due to the felonization of a multitude of things. That's before we get to the focus that has been placed, the over-policing of Black and Brown communities that have led to the disparities that we see. So in an effort to correct that, we are putting forth laws whereby people can apply to their sentencing judge to come home. And there are a multitude of states that are looking at this in a number of regards. And it's very exciting that a lot of states who sort of sit at the top of the carceral issues are looking at this legislation. One of them that we're working directly with is Michigan. Michigan has the worst sentencing grid in the country. It's one of the few that takes into account your adolescent record when they decide how to sentence you. There are massive disparities in the range of sentence and who gets sentenced where. They have an extremely large life without parole population. Their women serving life sentences is one of the highest in the nation. And, it's a population that, like so many carceral populations across the country, are aging rapidly and coming with all sorts of consequences to, society at large. It's time that we start to undo this harm. And Second Look is one of the mechanisms that the Sentencing Project is fighting for.
Okay. Thank you so much. Would either of you like to add to that, Mr. Gand or Mr. Douglas?
I'll be brief, and I just want to add, because Alice gave us like the legal definition. Now, say for a person who spent a lot of time in prison, I know a lot of people that are still there, and they're serving like insane sentences. Back when Michigan gave out what they call basketball score sentences, where they would sentence people to 50 to 100 years, and that would be their sentence. And as a result, that means that a person will have to do 50 years. So you can have 30 years in and still not what you would still not what we call you still wouldn't be short. And a lot of these men, they're literally like great people, and there's no valve for them to get out of prison. It's an absurd situation.
Incredible people.
Thank you. Alex, can you talk a little bit about why this type of legislation and the policy? I'm sorry, Mr. Douglas, go ahead before we get into that second part.
No, I was just going to say, as someone who, worked behind bars, I can say, if departments of corrections across the United States are supposed to, provide public safety, but also rehabilitate people, lengthy sentences don't keep us any safer. And you sort of take away the hope from people, right, who are serving their sentences. It's very dehumanizing to, sort of like Tony said, throw these basketball sentences at people and expect some type of positive outcome.
Thank you so much for that. All three of you mentioned the length of sentences and how when individuals at the time that they maybe committed their crime, All of the scholarship and all of the research shows that there's a grid that shows that individuals age out of criminal activity at a certain point in their life. So Alex, can you talk a little bit about why that portion of it is so important to these policies regarding a second look, and whether or not there's any risk of harm, of reoffending, and how that tendency or that propensity goes down after a certain number of years?
I mean, this is really the great myth of public safety, that long and lengthy sentences are a deterrent. They are not, all the way up to the death penalty. And we know this to be a fact. What we also know is that the human brain and the research that has come from our advances in brain science show us that the understanding of risk, the understanding of consequences, impulse control, the brain very simply is not fully developed until a person is almost to their late 20s. And in a state like Michigan, as I brought up as an example before, 40% of their prison population was sentenced under the age of 26, which really tells you something very important about the truth of that data. We know that criminality as a concept goes down within individuals as they age, as they come into reason. And I always say to legislators, just think about yourself as who you were at 20 or 19 years old versus who you were at 35 versus who you are at 45 versus who you are at 55. And it's very interesting that there's this double standard that exists where we ourselves as free individuals think that we can change. And yet we freeze people at a moment in time. One mistake, even if it was a terrible mistake in their life, and then extract all hope from them and expect that this is going, that we're going to keep our society safe. It's really sort of the great myth that goes around. For example, Washington, D.C., they have the IRA bill, the second look bill. My fellow here at the Sentencing Project, Warren Allen, was a recipient. We have over 200 people who've been released under this bill. I have the privilege of knowing many of them. I'm a commissioner in Washington, D.C. One of the IRA recipients actually ran to represent the prison. He was elected. He is now free. He continues to be an elected official. Knowing the recipients of the second look, they are quite literally some of the finest people I know, some of the greatest assets to our society. And I would argue, actually, people who are going to serve as some of the greatest deterrents to the thing that we actually fear with regards to public safety. We have to radically rethink everything about our carceral state.
Thank you for that. Mr. Gann or Mr. Douglas, would you like to add to that? And I know both of you mentioned actually having lived experiences or having actual contact with these individuals that are victims, if you will, of the excessive sentences that we engage in across this nation. Can you talk some about that and how you have witnessed yourself, how this myth that Andrea has talked about, Alexandria has talked about, is just that, is just a myth, because you have seen how these individuals grow over time and become very productive and will be much more productive on the outside than they are on the inside, meaning inside the walls. Mm-hmm.
You want to take a shot first, Darrell?
Yeah, I what immediately comes to mind, I think about, I remember, in Texas prisons, a lot of the disagreements start over the TV. And so a remote control, because they don't have TVs in cells. I'll keep this pretty brief. Long story short, one of the officers, I was a lieutenant at the time, said that one of the folks on 3-row had a remote. He saw him changing the TV on the run. So while they were out to chow, they went and found what was essentially a calculator that had been changed into a remote control. So when everybody, they went back from chow back to their cells, and of course, that person was brought before Vinny came in, and he thought he was in trouble. I wanted to know how he did it. And so I go and I look him up and I'm like, wow. And you see where sort of these little charges turn into getting out, not being able to find somewhere easily to live, to work. And then the charges sort of, got larger. And I think that, I want to say he was serving 20 years in Texas. And I just thought, it's a waste. Look at how much time was wasted, right? And so much of this, not only second look, but so many of the other things that we'll probably talk about later, really, we end up creating problems, not only in his life, in the life of his family, but in the life of his community. And just think about what he could be out there making other than turning calculators into remote controls.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Mr. Gann?
I think while I agree, right, we know science, because science tells us there's no deterrent impact for all these long sentences. I sometimes think that it's really just a punitive response to people, right? Especially like the people that bear the brunt of long sentences in Michigan. It's just because there's just like this intense need to keep these people incarcerated, even when the data shows, right, that they're not a harm, right, to society. The majority of them have aged out of crime, but we'll keep them there and spend like, yes. And here's my son, he's saying he agrees. Say, hey, man. Yes, I'm sorry, but yes, to me it's more punitive than even science-based, because we know, and I know men that would be like a huge asset to community if we would release them, but we would prefer to keep them incarcerated nevertheless. It's in the same system.
Thank you so much for that input. I think as we have this conversation about those excessive sentences, we also need to make sure we unpack what it means to serve a life sentence and some of the work that the Sentencing Project has done on the campaign to end life sentences, what that does to an individual as they sit on death row, if you will, if that's what they were sentenced to, but actually what it looks like for a life sentence for individuals who committed a crime, say when they were very young. What does that look like, and why is it important for the work that's being done to end a life sentence as we know it in the United States? Andrea, you want to take that?
I mean, ending life sentences means ending a great many things. Mm-hmm. We focus a lot on direct harm and not structural harm. And I always say that society often failed communities first and then punished them for their failure. It's almost like you actually get mad at people for the quality that you yourself have. Mm-hmm. So when our focus on direct harm, we're not dealing with structural harm, which is why we find ourselves in the same cycle. We've already know that lock them up longer does not work. According to the Vera Institute, there was an increase of 239% in Nebraska specifically between 1983 and 2015 in the people who were in jails and prisons, yes. Right? 239%. And yet there's not a single day that I pick up the news and hear this false narrative about crime spikes. Mm-hmm. What we actually know is that crime, we don't look at it, rather than looking at it year to year, you need to look at it over a long term. And what we know is that is going down, but our rate of incarceration is increasing. And I think we really need to start to grapple with why that is. To lock somebody up for a life sentence is a multi-million-dollar proposition. Mm-hmm. I was in conversations with a Department of Corrections that are literally going to be bankrupted in their medical budget by 2 people who had severe health episodes. Wow. I was recently at a judiciary hearing with, I want to say it was 60 witnesses who were families and supporters of people serving life without parole. Mm-hmm. And it was just so incredibly clear what the blast radius of these types of sentences are. And we're, 1 in every 15 women in this country is serving a life without parole sentence, and 58% of them have children who are minors. You create your own problems. And it's time that we start to take responsibility and look at deterrence mm-hmm. as opposed to incarceration. These sentences, people who are, a lot of people I know who are serving life without parole, they call it the walking death penalty. Somebody said to me the other day, I'm not sure that I don't wish that they hadn't executed me and saved my family 20, 30, 40 years of death by 1,000 cuts, of having no money and trying to spend money on phone calls and commissary for me, not being able to move because they can't, they want to be able to see me. There was a young woman who testified who had never knew her father outside of prison. There's a fabulous woman in Michigan who's serving life without parole. Her name is Susan Brown. And she was stabbed in her pregnant stomach, sexually assaulted by a former partner. And when she retaliated to defend herself and he subsequently died, she was sentenced to life without parole, and she didn't get to hold that baby. There is no justice in these sentences. Sorry, I get on a soapbox. It just winds me up.
That's okay. Thank you so much. Mr. Gant or Mr. Douglas, do you want to jump in, if you will? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to me, life without parole is akin to the death penalty, and I'm opposed to the death penalty as well. Just the data, the way it falls across racial lines is problematic. I know Alex mentioned the large population of Black women in Michigan that are serving life without parole. I seen one data point that said it was the largest population of women with life sentences in the nation. It's really problematic, and most of those people are Black people. The way that we sentence people is problematic. And then I'll add to the point that when I was incarcerated, people that had life without parole, they called it all day, right? They would say, like, I'm doing all day. And what they meant was there was no end to their sentence. It's to me, it's insanely inhumane to sentence anyone either to death or to sentence them to a sentence that says you will stay in prison until you die.
Thank you for that. Mm-hmm.
Specifically,
Mr. Douglas? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Specifically, when you look at Nebraska, it's in the news, there's overcrowding at the prisons, because people are serving longer portions of their sentences. And, it's really senseless because, like everyone else has said, it's been proven that, that does nothing for public safety. It does nothing for the individuals who are sentenced or their families, or in cases where they're victims as well. It's a no-win all the way around.
Okay, thank you so much. Can any of you, talk about some of the work that's being done around the campaign to end life sentencing, and maybe some of the jurisdictions and what some of those policies have been, and what some of the work is that is going on? I know you mentioned Michigan a lot in the conversation. I know there's some things going on in Vermont and some other places. So if any of you want to talk about some of the things that have happened around the campaign to end life sentencing.
Yeah, we have several jurisdictions that are looking to repeal life without parole, as in strike it from their books. Of course, the Sentencing Project, we fight for and with those communities. And we always insist upon a retroactive arm to go back and revisit those who are currently serving life without parole. We are working, we have an all-state coalition, and we support campaigns across the country: Alabama, Louisiana, Michigan. We're currently looking at Illinois, Massachusetts, Vermont, as you said, and we're also very focused on making sure that every state that proposes a second look law does not water down this term. Does not make this a feel-good bill for people who are nonviolent offenders, who have perfect records, and leave out the people who have really been damaged by prison. In Virginia, there's a young man named Taekwon Lee who was locked in solitary confinement for 600 days because he had untreated schizophrenia. He could never meet a behavioral standard that required perfect behavior from him, but he is exactly the type of person who should be given a second look. So we are insistent upon broad, inclusive second look bills. We're also looking at felony murder campaigns. Felony murder is this very interesting concept whereby, and this is often where many women get caught up. So just to give you an example, you're driving a car, somebody goes in and commits a homicide. You yourself was not even aware that this was going to happen, but you are now serving as if you had committed that crime. It is another gross overreach of how we sentence people to prop up prosecutorial records, to live out this very terrible tough on crime law. So we're currently looking to fight several of those statutes. And of course, as I said, we have a multitude of second look bills, some that we are serving in leadership of, some that we are simply supporting. But there are 24 states, I believe, that are looking at some version of a second look. We're involved in a multitude of those conversations, and it is the best job in the world.
Thank you so much for that. Alexandra, you mentioned retroactivity in your last explanation of what some of these bills look like and what the policy looks like. And I think one of the best examples we had of that was with the crack and powder type of comparison that we had. And when that law changed in 2010, it only applied to any new cases rather than being retroactive to those that had already been sentenced. Talk about the importance of retroactivity as we look at ending life sentencing and also looking at second look at those that are already serving time and reducing not just their sentences, but reducing the prison population and having a major impact on what incarceration, what we're calling mass incarceration in this country, how it can have an impact on all of that.
The damage is already done. And retroactivity is the only thing that addresses the damage that has already been done. It is very important to make sure that you do not persist in a problem, but it is just as important to take responsibility for the problem that has already been caused. And it is very important, I would argue, that elected officials, district attorneys, legislators let go of the ego of mistakes. In asking for a second chance for these individuals, I'm always amazed at their ability to forgive the harms that have been done to them, the injustices that have been done to them by the system. And actually, they show the greatest model of kindness and forgiveness that I've genuinely ever seen in my life. And in retroactivity, we're actually able to start to address these numbers. We're allowing people to leave, and we, as I said before, we have a very aging population of people who are incarcerated, allowing them to die with dignity, to live the last years of their lives with their family members, should they be remaining, is vital to undoing this and to bring some justice to the situation. But very frequently, there becomes this sort of political negotiation of people not wanting to go back and revisit the harm that has been done. And that is something that we stand very, very firmly against in every piece of legislation, and do not support legislation that does not have retroactivity.
Thank you so much. I think also part of the conversation has to be for those that are incarcerated. As we address these excessive sentences, we also have to talk about reentry and those that are coming home, or those that still have their rights as they're waiting to go to trial. So I would like to talk a little bit about jail-based voting. We did talk about that in part one of this session, but would like to give some updates and maybe give some further explanation, Mr. Douglas, and also Mr. Gannon, some of the work that you've done on jail-based voting, just to see where we are on that. Again, some of the jurisdictions that you've worked with and some of the progress that has been made. I know Cook County was kind of like the model of how this takes place with what they've done in Chicago, Illinois. So we could just talk some about re-enfranchising individuals rather than disenfranchising them, and how all of that happens with the jail-based voting.
Absolutely. So for folks that are watching, in most places, if you are, let's just use I'll use myself as an example. Back in 2008, I was driving in Texas with no insurance, got pulled over, and I was speeding too. Got pulled over, and of course you have to go to court. Went to court, they dropped, the judge told me, we'll drop your speeding ticket if you go ahead and take care of this insurance. Now, bad me, I didn't bring the insurance, but I actually had insurance. I think these days they can look it up a whole lot easier. Long story short, years go by. You know how it is. A day turns into a week, turns into a month, turns into you forgot about it. So I was pulled over years later. I think it was like maybe 2010. I get pulled over, and when that second cop car pulls up, settle down, buddy, you ain't going home tonight. And so it was weird, because up until that point, I had put handcuffs on people easily thousands of times. But when they were put on me, it was like, oh, okay. So that's what this is, right? And additionally, I was taken to jail, and I spent, it was quick for me, because by the time they found out I worked for the state and all this stuff. But I thought about, what if I was a single mother working second shift at Target or Walmart? What if I had missed my shift? You miss your shift, you're done with. Yes. But also, what happens to people who end up in jail during election time, right? For the overwhelming majority of jails that exist, there's no mechanism that's there, right? And so Nebraska probably is more in line, less in line with Illinois, which is a very progressive state. They do awesome. They pass good stuff every year. Mm-hmm. It's probably more like Texas, my home state, where in order to bring jail-based voting, we couldn't initially look towards the legislature. Our strategy is a more long firm, where we're starting with counties, mm-hmm. and our goal is to prove, hey, look, this is the law of the land, it's working, and the sky has not fallen down. Mm-hmm. Right? We have states like, in 2020, one of my favorite examples of jail-based voting being brought to a jail, I forget her first name, but there's a lady who in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, right, ended up working it out to where voter registration cards could be on the library card. Right. So in some states like California, you have the ACLU, mm-hmm. or these big orgs. But then in other states, it's just groups of people who say, you know what, let's expand democracy to this group of people who legally should have it. And I think the long form is everyone should be able to vote and participate in democracy. But as it stands right now, there are states where there is legislation, and you can see where, and some of y'all that are on this call probably can remember, that have worked within legislation, that first year you may not get it, but you keep swinging at the X, and the more often it's brought forth, it gets chiseled, it gets polished, the coalition grows, and then eventually you get a bill. So even in places like Texas, Nebraska, Florida, Virginia, there's some really exciting things that are happening when it comes to jail-based voting.
Thank you so much. Mr. Gant, you want to talk about some of your experience with jail-based voting and some of the experiences you've had? I believe you testified on some of the bills and also talked with the powers that be inside the criminal justice system, and talk about some of those things and what your experience was, some of those obstacles that you came up against, and some of the triumphs and some of the wins that you experienced.
And so we still haven't got a state law, but we're really close in Michigan. I'll say that, that we got the help of the Sentencing Project to get a first of its kind report on jail-based voting in the state of Michigan. From that, we're going to get the first of its kind legislation around jail-based voting in Michigan. We're working on draft language right now, going back and forth. Not everybody is as passionate as I about protecting this population. I'm beginning to see. But the reason I want to protect this population is twofold. One, this is the same population that has been disenfranchised throughout history. These are the same people, right? Mm-hmm. So this is coming in under another guise. So that burns me up. That's the first one that burns me up. Second, it's just a constitutional right. Like, nobody should be opposed to it. It just doesn't make sense. Thirdly, I'll add that the data shows when we begin to engage people in jail around voting, that the odds are great that they'll continue to do that when they're released. So we get community buy-in from people that wouldn't otherwise had community buy-in. So it's a win-win, right? We're engaging people civically. We're getting them involved with the election process. Oftentimes, they've never voted before. So now we get community buy-in. This is what's missing. This is a huge missing piece. I'm hoping we'll get legislation dropped this session. And then, we're fighting. We're fighting.
Okay, great. Mr. Gant, you mentioned that report that you were able to engage in with some help through the Sentencing Project. Talk about the importance of that report, how that kind of helped propel the whole process and get some buy-in, as you stated, from the community, from legislators, from both sides of the House, and how that helped overall in the process with moving it forward towards what is going to be enacted into law soon.
Well, I'm not going to say soon, right? I'm optimistic. Okay. We're going to win. We may not win this session, but we're definitely going to win. With respect to the report, the reason the report was important is because before then, what we were doing is we were doing like kind of a hopscotch around the state. And in Michigan, there are 83 counties, right? And each of those counties, for the most part, with the exception of 2, have a county jail. So we were hopscotching around the state to those county jails that were open to allowing people to register people held in jail, right? And for the most part, that was less than 10 counties. And so what I said was, let's step back and really think about this, because we're celebrating wins in 5 counties, but the overwhelming majority of people held in jail are not voting. So let's step back, let's really do some research, let's get the data done, and let's look at the state as a whole. And once we can see the state as a whole, we can then go to lawmakers and say, this is what's going on. We have the data, we have the report.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And for us, say, in a place like Nebraska, if we wanted to go that same route. So how did you start your whole process with approaching, first of all, the Sentencing Project? Kudos to the Sentencing Project, approaching them for the assistance and maybe even the funding to gather the data to compile the report.
So that's pretty interesting. Darrell, right? We got into, how did we get into this relationship? This is so weird. How did we get into this relationship?
Yeah, so the Sentencing Project year before last, with the murder of George Floyd, ended up getting an influx of donations because people wanted to be involved. And so they said, okay, Sentencing Project was among those organizations. And so the Sentencing Project believes in, when there's an influx in sharing, right, those proceeds with on the ground work that's happening. And so there were several states. Massachusetts was one, and Michigan was another, and there were some others too that ended up getting this funding, to move the meter on jail-based voting. So that looks different in different states, right? So in a state like Texas, where every other week they're disenfranchising somebody else. And let's be clear here about who the population is that is being disenfranchised, okay? They look like those of us on this call, on this side, right? Yes. And it's poor people, right? The very people who would be hit the hardest are who they're disenfranchising. Like, they don't want poor people, Black people, brown people to vote, like, period, right? Mm-hmm. So, that is kind of the beginning. And I think it looks different in every state. Like, it's like a spades hand. You got to play the hand you're dealt, right? Yes. And you got to figure out, like, the best way to go at it. And I think, y'all in Nebraska, Omaha specifically, in that Douglas County, yes, right? My last name, yes. Douglas, come on.
Yes.
Like, y'all are doing, the people on this call are part of the group that gets the wheel turning. Yes. And not to cut you off, Tony, but in the
now remember though, it came back. I was trying to remember. I got it.
In the places where we've seen success, it's always been a mighty few who said, you know what? We're so far off course, but we're going to get there. And they never take their eyes off the prize.
Oh, the mighty few.
Yes.
Awesome.
Oh, the mighty few.
Yes, yeah. It's a heavy lift, but heavy is the head that wears the crown that gets that work done. Absolutely. So that is a very good segue. Thank you so much for that information about the jail-based voting. We would not have a complete conversation if we did not talk about gender-specific incarceration as it relates to the female population. So Alexandra, if you could talk some about your experience with that population, collateral consequences for females, and how the female population, for obvious reasons, we know they are different than the male population, but there are different needs. There are different traumas and different baggage, if you will, that follows them into their incarcerations that oftentimes goes unaddressed. Talk some about that population.
There's been so many movements, the Me Too movement and all of these things, and it's amazing how women who are incarcerated get left out of these conversations, both prior to their incarceration and during their incarceration. So nationwide, 1 of every 15 women in prison, that's over 6,600 women, are serving life without parole. We currently have 52 women sitting on death row, and the rate of incarceration of females since 1980 has jumped by about 700%. And for life without parole, since 2008, it has grown by 43%. And we have Florida, Pennsylvania, California, Michigan, Louisiana, and Mississippi really leading the way on that one. And there's a very specific experience that happens for women in prison that is different. There's a type of victimization that happens that is different. And the concerns going in are in fact different. 58% of women who are currently incarcerated have a child who's a minor. And even though they are a smaller percentage of the incarcerated population, it's shocking, the disparities. But actually what we're seeing is that the rate of women incarcerated across races is increasing. That incarceration is almost becoming really racially non-discriminatory towards women. It's just sucking women into the system at really alarming rates. And the problem with this also is because abuse and trauma, domestic violence, so many of these types of traumas often play into this, where women are disproportionately affected, like I said, by things like felony murder. They're often parties to things. They actually tend to offend later in life. So they're actually disproportionately sentenced more frequently. And that's before we take into account the specific concept that society has of what women are supposed to be in society, right? And that ends up causing them to have really disproportionate sentences. And their mental health issues, very specifically, are treated very differently in prison. Fluvanna Prison in Virginia, for example, is under a massive lawsuit because they've been locking women with mental health issues down for 23 hours a day. It's become so incredibly rampant. In Michigan, there's this rather disgusting history of what's called the touch me money. Where sexual assault was so widespread that one of the women's prison was shut down, and now the only one that is still there, I believe, is Huron. Is that right, Tony? I think Huron's the only one left now. And even the conditions there was a rally there recently. And one of the arguments that I've made against some second look bills that are very reliant upon behavioral standards while people are incarcerated is, when I spoke to women in Virginia specifically who are incarcerated about this, what they said to me is that if you put corrections officers in the situation that we're dealing with the power to take away our second look based on giving us dings or behavioral demerits, basically, in prison, you're basically going to turn this place into a brothel. And that's not a joke. Like, it's already happening. These lawsuits are already happening. Prisons have been shut down because of it. So when we think about these bills, about these second look bills and the qualifications that we're putting forth for them, we do have to put a gender lens on it.
Can you talk also some about the disproportionate impact that the female population generally shows up with a Black face? What those statistics look like in the experience that you've had, some of the facilities that you've worked with. What does that look like in comparison to their population in the general public?
We have massive disparities. One of every 39 women in prison serving a life without parole sentence is Black, compared to one of 59 white women. In Michigan, one of 11 women is a Black woman who's serving an extreme sentence. In Mississippi, it's 1 in 12. In Louisiana, it's 1 in 14. Basically, if you are going to look at an incarcerated population of women, you are going to be looking at Black women. And there's so much harm that comes before that doesn't get addressed. The pain of Black people in general, but Black women very specifically, is ignored and dismissed in this society. And we see it everywhere, from the rate of Black women who die in childbirth to what they experience in the carceral state. And this trend is so incredibly damaging. And yet I meet women like Susan Brown, the woman who I told you who survived a terrible assault on her life and on her sexually. And she is a brilliant artist. I highly recommend everybody Google her. She's an incredible artist. And she's an incredible person, and she's going to die in there unless we do something. And so we're going to do something.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So as part of this redlining project that I'm involved with the university, one of the things we're looking at is those long-term consequences of the impact that redlining has had within certain zip codes, certain neighborhoods. And there's also this correlation of within those zip codes and neighborhoods, high police saturation, if you will, policing within those neighborhoods, but also police contact, incarceration based on your zip code or particular block that you may live on, and how that has consequences for individuals, particularly the female population, and how it may have some generational effects on, say, our daughters, if we do not do something to bring all of this to some type of, number one, attention to the general public, and then do what we can to bring it to a screeching halt. Talk some about those collateral consequences and how it may have a generational effect, again, on another female generation. And I see you nodding in agreement with all of these conversations that are generally left out of the major topic.
So I'm sorry I'm taking up so much space, Tony.
No, that's okay.
But
that's
literally,
okay.
I was in housing and police work at the ACLU. That was my prior career. So you are speaking my language. So, I mean, when the war on crime started in 1965, we saw a spike in everything from police presence to how we sentence to stacking sentences. And then the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act just kept adding to that. And we have such a reliance on police and carceral tools. And I think there are just so many things that people don't know. Like 13 of the 100 largest US police departments kill Black men at a higher rate than the US murder rate. I mean, just let that like sink in.
Yes.
We talk about the murder rate all the time. It is the only thing that you hear about on the news 90% of the time, unless we're at war. 13 of the 100 largest US police departments kill Black men at a higher rate than the US murder rate. And those are people's fathers. Those are people's sons. I mean, go to almost any neighborhood that's been redlined, throw a stone and you'll hit a Black woman who's lost a member of her family. And I don't even know how you scientifically quantify that kind of trauma. Mm-hmm. I remember my grandmother, she has 3 sons. She lost one Black man in our family, one. Her greatest pride in life was that she kept them all, but she lost one, and I swear she will never forgive herself. I don't know how to quantify that, but you walk around the community and the damage is just clear.
Thank you so much for that. Something else you touched on that I'd just like to revisit, and then we'll go to questions. We're at 7 o'clock now, but you talked about the crime of conviction for women and how generally their entryway into the criminal justice system is generally going to be a collateral or ancillary role to the major player, if you will. Talk some about that.
I mean, so felony murder catches women up. You know, where abusive, coercive relationships most certainly play into it. You know, and then there's, you know, it's hard to explain, but really one of the things that I always say is that, you know, people are going to feed their families. They're going to do what they have to do to take care of their families, to take care of themselves. And when you talk about all this trauma, right, we've covered all this trauma that happens, and there's no help. People turn to substance abuse. Poverty has its own impacts. And so you find very frequently what happens is you have petty theft. And then things start to stack and increase, right? And then you get to that point where our judicial stacking system really hits you. And it's like, all right, well, this is your third offense. And now you go away for a long time.
Yes.
So a lot of times for women, it's that incremental build that happens. And again, a lot of the time, they just happen to be there. And that's enough. You know, defending yourself, any sort of loss of life, you know, the sexism comes in, and, you know, we watch the rate of women who are incarcerated to life without parole. And it's worth noting that, yes, while homicide plays into that a lot of women are sent away with life without parole, not for loss of life. We've criminalized to such an extent that this is now punishment for things like robbery in some states, theft. After a certain amount of charges, you go away for these long sentences. And this is really one of the areas where we see women get caught up.
Okay, thank you so much. We are going to go to questions at this time. Professor Hurd, are you there for us so we can go to the participants to answer their questions?
All right, so we do have one question in the Q&A, and I guess this one is for Alexandra. I know before you said that, so you're talking about the woman who was incarcerated for defending herself against a dangerous predator. How many women had these unfair sentences for defending themselves?
I don't think there's an exact number, but based on kind of what we know from the Sentencing Project's data and interviews, most of them. I can say personally, I have never talked to an incarcerated woman where trauma and abuse did not play as a factor in why they are where they are. And it's just so interesting that we want to focus on incarcerating them rather than stopping it before it begins. If you're somebody who cares about women, then I highly recommend that you push your legislators to focus on that.
And that just reminds me of the woman who was being abused by her husband in Florida, I believe it was. And she didn't even shoot him. She just fired her gun to get him away. And she ended up going to prison.
Yes. and then we have, you know, when it comes to sort of LGBTQ women and trans women, I mean, they'll kill their trafficker and go to jail. And go to prison. I mean, honestly, I will put our report here in the chat. I highly recommend, if you are interested in the carceral rates of women and girls, take a look at this. I think you'll find it as disturbing as I do every time I read it, even though I've read it dozens of times. We've taken away most Black men and sucked them into this state. And I guess because we have victimized them to such an incredible extent, we have a new target.
So I had a question to follow up with Alexandra, because when we were talking before we went online, you were mentioning the second look and women. Can you speak a little bit more about the specific kind of infractions that they were incurring that gets them, because they're very gender specific? It's something that we can all, as women, can relate to.
Yeah, so there are usually a ranking of infractions in most states, but in this specific state, there were two levels, 100 and 200 serious infractions. 200 serious infractions you can get for almost anything. I've heard people get 200 serious infractions because they were caught having an extra blanket because they were cold. That they got a 200 serious infraction because they didn't walk fast enough. They had an extra cup of coffee. They were caught with too much commissary. The type of average everyday mistake that anybody could make. There's a man who's actually a second look recipient. His name is Reginald Bell. He got put into solitary confinement for almost a year because when he came to a new facility, he stepped over the wrong line, not realizing he wasn't allowed to step over that line coming out of his cell, right? So these types of infractions are very, very easy to get. But if women complain about things like sanitary items, if you hug somebody in the visiting room for too long, and they want to hold their children, they want to hold their, they want to hug the people that they love, you get in trouble for that. And then, that's before we get to sexual harassment. There are many groups that are working on shackling laws as to whether or not women have to be shackled when they're giving birth in a state of incarceration. We're fighting for legislation to allow babies to stay with their incarcerated mothers long enough that they won't have the damage that comes from that early separation, right? And when they fight and object to these things happening to them, they are punished for them. And it is very specific to women. And even complaining about pain or being sick and being too insistent upon getting help can cause you problems. I was at a legislative hearing with a woman who, in this particular prison setting, when you filed a complaint against a guard, you had to give that guard your complaint. What resulted in that for her was that the guard then claimed that she was suicidal, stripped her naked, and put her in a cell for several days where she was not fed and subsequently lost 30 pounds.
Wow. Because
she was being mistreated. And she had to go to the person who was mistreating her and hand in her complaint. There was a bill introduced in a state recently where cops wanted to make it legal to have sex with somebody who was in custody. What do you think they're talking about? So when it comes to sort of behavioral standards being the basis for Second Look, this is a very specific impact on women. And we already see a great deal of extortion of women. And so I certainly don't take anything away from what happens to men because it's gross. But there are very specific things that happen to women that we also need to be looking at. And just because they're a smaller portion of the carceral population doesn't mean that they shouldn't be considered in our legislation.
Okay. All right, so we have another question from the audience. The strike three rule is a really ridiculous concept, in my opinion. Is this also one of the problems that feeds the roller coaster of incarceration and also unfair sentencing?
Oh, yes. And Tony and Darrell, please jump in here because I'm on a roll. I think I had too much coffee this afternoon or something. So I can do you one better. Go look at ballot 11 in Oregon. One strike, you're out. One strike, you're out. And so ballot 11 in Oregon, the one strike, you're out rule requires that you have to serve, I believe it's 85 or 90% of what you're sentenced to. There's extreme mandatory minimums attached, including life. And the only way you can change ballot 11, any sentencing law, as it were, is ballot 11 is protected by something called ballot 10, that in order to change any sentencing law, you're required a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. So basically, in order to change this strike law, you have to reach what is an almost insurmountable political hurdle. So 3 strikes, yeah, absolutely adding to the problem. We're at 1 strike in some states. So yeah, I would say that 3 strike laws are adding to the problem. The stacking of charges is adding to the problem. Habitual offender laws are one of the major things that the Sentencing Project's going to be focusing on in our campaign. But I haven't even been here a year, but I'm working on it.
Do we have other questions, Professor Hurd? I have one for the 3 of you if we don't have anything in the chat right now.
Yeah, there's nothing in the Q&A.
Okay, so I was just wondering through any of your work with the 3 of you, one of the things that has happened in Evanston, Illinois is they have, of course, legalized marijuana in that state. And one of the things they've done is to assess a kind of tax to the sale of the marijuana. And they take those funds and created what they're calling a reparations fund. And they are now paying reparations to individuals in Evanston in particular, who have a particular lineage to a particular area in the city and in the state. Because they looked at also retroactivity once marijuana was legalized in that state, so that there were several individuals whose crime would have been possession of marijuana, were benefactors, if you will, of that retroactivity. And I guess that's another way for us to think about how important retroactivity is. But I was just wondering if any of your work that you've been doing with several jurisdictions, if the concept of using legalization of marijuana has played in any way in a release of individuals who had those types of crimes, in retroactivities of any bills that you've worked on, or if there are other ways that you can see that also being a piece of the full conversation.
In Michigan, what they've done with the legalization of most marijuana offenses is expungement for those people that have been convicted of crimes are a lot easier, right? Michigan passed one of the most expansive expungement laws in the country. And as a result of that, those people that have most marijuana convictions are able to seal their record. I think they should be pardoned, actually, but it's just sealed from public view. Secondly, I know a number of people have been released that had marijuana convictions. But for me, that's kind of low-hanging fruit. It's spreading across the country. Nobody really should be in prison for a marijuana offense. Obviously, it's really not, it doesn't make any sense, right? I think the toughest conversation are for people that had convictions like mine that are violent offenses. Those are the tough conversations.
I would say sort of like leaning into like what are some of the things very similar to that are sort of solutions. I actually worked in the Texas Ledge 10 years ago, and there was an amazing bill that would have said, if it's your first offense and you've completed your individual treatment plan, which is like what they give you in Texas when you get in, that when you came up for parole, you would automatically make parole. And so it started off going very well, but, you know, then you have to deal with what are called carve-outs. So like, you know, Tony was just talking about, you know, you had one group that said, yeah, but not these people, right? So not those with violent offenses. And then you carve out another group, and then you carve out another group. And then at the end of the day, you're right where you started, right? So that's something that could have been a solution that, you know, sort of went out the window.
This is one thing I do love about the Sentencing Project. We hold the line on our legislation. Like, we are not willing to pass legislation that sounds good and doesn't do good.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy with legislation because you can have pages of legislation, but you change a shall to a may, or you've gutted the whole thing. And that's some of the games that will get played, you know?
Absolutely. Okay, so if we don't have other questions.
I actually did. I did have
okay.
one other question.
Okay.
So one of the, excuse me, one of the topics that we're covering is collateral consequences. And so we did talk briefly about, you know, mothers being imprisoned, but I want if each of you could kind of speak to the effects of, first of all, having the male out of the community, then also removing females from households who are probably mothers, the effects on the children, as well as those who are left behind to care for those children or other members of the family.
2.7 million children have a parent serving time in prison or jail, and over 5.2 million have had an incarcerated parent at some point in their lives. And, you know, the consequences, you know, are a system that keeps on recreating itself. I mean, that creates trauma. It increases poverty. We're going to see psychological and antisocial behaviors that are going to be an effect of that. We're going to see a decrease in educational performance. We're going to see a decrease in health. You know, listening to families at one of the judiciary hearings recently, you know, they say you serve with them. You know, and I think we really need to start thinking that when you sentence somebody to these long and indeterminate sentences, you're sentencing children and families too. You know, I watch grandmothers, you know, trying to live as long as humanly possible, just in the hope that they can get that grandkid to their 18th birthday.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. In Michigan, I believe it's like 10% right now of Michigan children have a parent that's incarcerated, which is a huge number of children. And it's deeper than that, right? That's just like the parent that's gone. But even when the parent returns, right, the parent faces all these collateral consequences, that's why you see the numbers. Like for me, I have a son, he's 3 times more likely to be incarcerated. It's not because he's more criminal than other children. It's just because his father, right, is going to have to face all these consequences as a result of having a criminal record in housing and employment and in healthcare and then trying to get into higher.
Oh, Tony, did everybody else lose his audio, or was that just me?
Yes, we did. We lost your audio, Tony.
Tony, we lost your audio.
I'm sorry, I broke up.
There we go.
Yeah,
we got
you back. Okay.
I'm sorry, my fault. Yeah, spotty internet. But so you have like a generational curse as a result of that, right? The child suffers as a result of a parent's criminal history. And so that's how those collateral consequences end up resulting in children also being incarcerated. And I would love to see the day when we really start peeling back the onion of what mass incarceration has done to the Black community, when we really start peeling back all the layers of harm.
Okay, so that brought up some more questions. People start putting, I got somebody raised a hand, and I got 2 more questions in the Q&A. So we have a question. I belong to a book club that is part of a group focused on ending cycles of incarceration. We're looking for a book for our group that focuses on the impact of incarceration on family systems. Do you have any suggestions on books addressing this topic?
Oh, so Lord, can I send an email?
I was going to recommend a book called Bending the Arc by Keita Haynes, who's one of our colleagues at the Sentencing Project. And it's a really good read. It's a really good read. I would recommend. It talks about her, and you know, you could feel the impact on family as well.
Darrell, can you put that in the chat?
Yes.
The name of the book and the name of the author.
And
Thank you.
Not to continue to plug the Sentencing Project, but one of our lead researchers wrote a book called The Meaning of Life. And it is a Bible about incarceration. I also highly recommend that. Locking Up Our Own is also very good. And if you haven't read Dark Ghettos, that's a good one. I'm actually like, sorry, I'm looking over this way. I'm like looking at my bookshelf because it's like nothing but this topic. Chokehold is another really interesting book, coming very specifically from the male perspective. And then there's one that's
boom.
There it is. There it is.
Yes, I don't travel without it.
Yeah, I'll send an email.
Thank you.
All right, and the next question is, what can someone who is getting their PhD in criminal justice and criminology and studies crime and victimization among marginalized populations, specifically within the Indigenous community, what can I or we do to help those who are incarcerated with research?
You can't help the problem if you don't know what the problem is. You know, it's amazing how little research has actually been done on women in mass incarceration. It's amazing how many sections of mass incarceration have not been thoroughly studied. So I always recommend to everyone I know in research, and one of the things I love about our researchers at the Sentencing Project is that their reports are what we try to turn into laws. So get hooked up with advocates who are in the state legislature and be like, hey, this is a problem that I see. How do we write a bill and get a bill passed that takes care of that?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what she just said, you know, you hold a unique role in academia, because I believe that to really truly move the ball down the field, it takes not only the stories, right, and the people from the community, it also takes that becomes your currency. I can tell you, when it comes to jail-based voting, you know, we could only get to a certain point with our stories and everything else. Once we were able to add, you know, the statistics and the research to it, you can't really argue against that. And that really made the difference.
Also, lend your skills to people who are writing bills so that we can know specifically the impact of the bill. How many people does this actually help? So make sure that you always write the right bill, right? And data has to be central to that. And as far as I'm concerned, if you're not helping as many people as possible, then you're doing it wrong.
Thank you so much for saying that, Alexandra. And I would like each of you to address this issue also, because it raised something else for me, that we are having a discussion right now in our legislature regarding victim impact statements. And one of our new powerhouses, who is Terrell McKinney, is difficult to explain to those that don't have the lived experiences or don't look like us, the importance of a victim impact statement when you are proposing bills, laws, and enacting laws, and why that's important, and how it affects communities of color in particular. In your experiences, each of you in working with legislatures and others, have you had that conversation about victim impact statements? Was it something automatic? Is it something that you push for? And how does that fit into the whole conversation for the Sentencing Project?
I mean, most states have a victim's bill of rights, right, that you have to work with. So I guess I'm a survivor of violent crime. I'm a survivor of domestic violence, you know, that put me into a state of homelessness and you know, other things. And what I'll say, and what I often say when I'm talking to people who are, you know, survivors, that the system fails both sides. You know, the concept of dual victimhood is really not understood, and it's not how we talk about impact statements. And the fact of the matter is that we don't help people to heal and move on. And we create a system where not only are the people who are incarcerated this thing that happened to them, or that this thing that they did, but that survivors are only this thing that happened to them. I know, and it's not as simple as prosecutors like to make it. I mean, I know women who are survivors of violent crime who got threatened that if they didn't testify, they were going to up the charges on this person. And this is sometimes like, you know, the father of their children. They don't want that. They want something else, but we have two choices. And we need a third path. And when it comes to these discussions, yes, sometimes terrible things happen and healing needs to happen. But what I can say is that holding on to that anger, it's like swallowing poison and waiting for someone else to die.
Yes.
It doesn't work. It poisons you and you don't heal. And quite frankly, there's very little resources to help you heal. And this is also why we see an underreporting. So people who are sort of so concerned with the victims of crimes actually really are only listening to the voice that gives the confirmation bias that they want to continue a mass carceral state. And survivors are not a monolith. And Black and brown communities want something different. And it's not offered. The only thing they offer us is cops and lock them up. So, you know, if you're a state legislature that cares about people who are survivors of whatever, then you actually need to listen and not just to the people who agree with you.
Thank you. Professor Hurd, do we have other questions?
No, that was all the questions that we had.
Okay, so before we wrap up, what I'd like to hear from each one of you are some action steps or a call to action for not just us here in Nebraska, but for anyone on the call who may be outside of Nebraska that is thinking about engaging in this work, particularly as it relates to a second look type of policy or legislation, and then also re-enfranchisement where the vote is concerned. Speak to specifically, we talked a little bit about reentry, but didn't get a chance to unpack a lot of it. But for us here in Nebraska, there's a 2-year waiting period before you have an opportunity to vote. Some states have a permanent bar. I think there's still a few states that still have a lifetime bar for voting. And some states automatically, once you come home, once you walk outside of the gates, then you are reinvested in your right to vote. So talk some about those things and give us some action steps.
So that was a lot, Professor. And,
no, I'm sorry.
I'm not going to try to tackle all that. I'm going to leave that to Alex to tackle. My call to action is going to be a little simple. I just want people that will hear the video, especially for poor people, especially for Black people. And I know oftentimes we're stuck in situations where we're looking at what we got to do next. We got to pay this bill. We got to go to work. I just want them to understand how important the issue of mass incarceration is to their everyday life. For me, I have a family that's been riddled by it. But it's hard to organize the family because they got, jobs, they got bills. But if we don't really stop and pause and really think about this in a deep way, we're going to have our next generations in the prisons and in the jails.
Yes, totally agree. I came up with 3 things, 3 simple ideas. Somewhere around you, wherever you are, there's an org, there's a campaign that you're supposed to be part of. Find that thing and try a couple of them. It's like picking out a couch or a mattress. You sit on one, maybe this is not it. Okay, maybe I tried another one. The second thing, start the conversation. To the person who asked about what if I'm a PhD student, even if you're not a PhD student, you starting the conversation at home you doing a post and saying, hey, I was on this thing today and here's what I learned. What do you think? You'd be surprised how that starts a ripple that ends up touching somebody else and gets them to think about it and look at it. And especially, in your classrooms and in other places where you have some type of influence. And then the last part, when it comes to all of these very complex issues, if you're like me, you used to assume that like the government and the legislators have it all figured out and they're really smart and, they know what we don't know. And then, I remember when I was in the 5th grade, first time I brought home homework, it was multiplying fractions and my mom didn't know how to do it. And I was like, wait a minute. You're supposed to know everything. So that was kind of my first, guess what? The government and these structures are the same way. So where you are could easily be like the answer to a lot of these issues. So don't think small. Don't think like you might be it. So reach out, have the conversations. Are you the key? And find a home, a place to plug in your energy. Because that's what it's going to take to really move the ball down the field.
Well, I'm going to be a little bit more selfish and put my email in the chat. And if you want to join our all-state meetings, I'm always about collecting more power under our banner. We have people who show up from all across the country. So what I will say first is that the Sentencing Project is a resource for you. I started out as an organizer. There's nothing better than learning to become an organizer. I have watched people change states. Just one person who gets a fire, and if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? So I second what Darrell said, but yes, if you ever need anything or you wish to join our all-state meeting, please come and join us. We're doing a lot of really fantastic work in the Lifer campaign and in our jail-based voting campaign. And I guess on a personal note, what I'll say is I think the greatest preventative measure that I engage in my personal life is mutual aid. My community has an expansive mutual aid network. There's no barrier to entry. It's cash, it's food, it's whatever you need, and it's always high quality. And allowing people to take the pressure of necessity away allows them to start to lend their creativity. So if you are in a position of privilege to do that, or some privileged institutions, jump on them, extract those resources, bring them to your community, because when we are all together, we have enough. But these systems are designed to make us be alone. They're designed to tear apart community. And I think the protection and care of community is the greatest preventative measure that we have. So start a mutual aid network, get involved. And if you have time, come hang with me.
Thank you so much, each one of you. I cannot express how grateful I am that each of you carved time out this evening to be on this call for us to have this very important conversation with everyone on the line. I believe we have local people and some people outside of Nebraska. This was necessary. This is important. And I thank each one of you for contributing to this conversation and providing us with your contact information so we can do some follow-up. Professor Hurd, anything else to add? Any other questions that came into the chat? And if not, if you want to close this out, I think we are ready to close out.
So there are no more questions in the Q&A or in the chat. Alexandra, if you would send us a list of those books, I'll make sure that we put them on our website so that those people who wanted to know the names of some books, we'll put them on the website so you'll be able to access them there. And I just wanted to let you know, if you weren't here last week, we had a similar discussion in our previous webinar with Dr. Andy Eisen, where he was talking about the historical work that they were doing with some incarcerated men in Florida and also with incarcerated women in Indiana. So they're actually doing historical research. So if you were interested in this discussion, I would advise you to go onto our YouTube channel to check out last week's presentation. You'll be interested in that as well. So next week is spring break for UNO, so we won't be having a session next week. However, in 2 weeks, we'll be having two. So our next webinar will be with Professor Dr. Joseph Akpan, who'll be talking about state, society, and strategy of economic development, analysis and critique of development of theories in Africa. So that'll be next Tuesday, not next Tuesday, but the following Tuesday, the 22nd at 2 o'clock. And our second presentation of the week will be on that Thursday, the 24th at 6 p.m. Dr. Mariam Konate from Western Michigan University will be talking about an African-centered analysis of African literature. So as always, our webinars will be recorded. So if you're not able to attend live, you'll be able to see them on the YouTube channel. So I would like to thank our panelists for being here today. Wonderful presentation. We enjoyed it.
Yeah.
There's several comments in the chat. Great presentation. Thank you. It was very timely. It's very essential for us to have this discussion because these are things that impact our community. If we don't come up with solutions, our future is just going to be more and more damaged. You know, the impact is going to be on our children, on our grandchildren, great-grandchildren. So we have to come up with solutions to these problems. So thank you for our panelists being here, our excellent panelists, and thank you to our audience for being here with us tonight. Thank you and have a good night.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.